Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country just before we get started. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we create and share our learning resources. We acknowledge the traditional owners as the original storytellers, teachers and students of the land we call Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I'm presenting on Wurundjeri country, which is part of the Kulin Nation. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us for our third of our 4-part webinar series on applying the science of reading in your classroom. My name is Bryn, I'm part of the marketing and events team at Oxford University Press here in Melbourne. Today we will explore the topic of the benefits of spaced retrieval and practice, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this webinar, Dr. Nathaniel Swain. With expertise in language, literacy, instructional practices and cognitive science, Dr. Swain is dedicated to empowering teachers to develop life-changing language and literacy skills in every student through effective and engaging teaching. He's a teacher, instructional coach, and writer. He produces a blog for teachers called Dr. Swain's Cognitorium and is co-host of the Chalk Dust podcast with Rebecca Birch. Having worked at universities and government school systems in Victoria, Nathaniel has taught a range of learners in schools and tertiary settings. Dr. Swain founded a community of teachers committed to the science of learning, Think Forward Educators, now 25,000 members and growing. Dr. Swain is a sought-after speaker on educational circuits and has a best-selling book entitled Harnessing the Science of Learning, Success Stories to Help Kickstart Your School Improvement. Nathaniel has also contributed as a literacy and instructional expert on Oxford's new systematic synthetic phonics program, Essential Letters and Sounds Australia. Welcome, Nathaniel, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Bryn, and thank you everyone for taking the time to share in some learning this evening. One of my favorite things to talk about is space and retrieval practice. And I'm really excited to talk about those particular topics, and also not just thinking about your current sort of set of strategies, but also how ELSA seeks to take advantage of some of these learning strategies as well. There's a little bit of suggested reading. There's some handouts that are going to be available for this session from the Oxford University Press team. There are also some suggested readings to learn more about the theory and the research behind these practices, and I've listed those throughout the presentation as well, so keep a lookout. Some great readings, and usually when you Google these things, some great podcasts and things that come up as well. So I'm keen to get stuck into it with you. Essentially, we're wanting to review a little bit to sort of practice what we preach here, basically to sort of look at some of our previous sessions to make sure that we've got some shared knowledge and skills, if you like. So the first thing I want to do is review how do students learn to read, and why does systematic synthetic phonics help, or how it helps. And then I'll move into the new topic of today, which is around the retrieval practice and spaced practice. So in case you didn't catch the first one, or if this is forgotten because it's now a few months ago, children become competent readers with at least three key sort of theories that explain how this happened. The first one is orthographic mapping. The second is self-teaching hypothesis. And the third is called set for variability. And I'm just going to remind you what some of these are. But before I do, can someone help me remember what orthographic mapping is by putting this into the chat? So just reminding you here, there's a bit of a visual to help you. It's something to do with this image, and it's something to do with mapping. So let me see if you remember this already, or if you've already got this in your long-term memory, and then I'll give you the answer. And if you haven't got the chat facility ready to go, basically try and do this process mentally to try and activate your understanding of what orthographic mapping is. And here I've got some here. Tina's saying mapping the sounds in words to visual and auditory memory. Nicola's got mapping the letters which correspond to the sounds in a word. Michelle's saying connecting the sounds represented by the letters with a meaning or context. Okay, so let me just see if we're right. It is to do with mapping the letters to their corresponding sounds. and then accessing meanings that are then activated. So the way that orthographic mapping works is that we're basically gluing the threads or the connections between these different things together, which then makes the automatic recognition possible. So eventually, when students have learnt this process really, really well and they've mapped a word, so orthographically mapped it, when they see that word, they almost can't stop themselves decoding it because it becomes automatic. But initially, orthographic mapping, that sort of initial process will look quite laborious. That slow process of sounding things out, sort of ah, and it doesn't sound a lot like the finished product of seeing the word map and just reading map, for example. So each sound needs to be learned and seeing how it comes together in a word and then blended together. And in that way, orthographic mapping requires that phonemic awareness and also that code knowledge of what each sound makes. So the other key one that I want to talk to you about is the self-teaching hypothesis. And the self-teaching hypothesis, in case you've forgotten it, is where we actually can't teach students to read every word. And at some point, their ability to learn and to generalize practices will actually kick in. So David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis is that once students are decoding connected text independently, they work to generalize these abilities to novel words. So essentially all of that work with decoding practice, all that work sort of sounding out and blending and hopefully getting more and more fluent on sentences and then texts, eventually leads to students figuring out how other words are spelt and figuring out what those words would be based on new patterns that they crack the code for. This explains how students can figure out the spellings or the pronunciations of unknown words, and is essentially helped by that initial success in decoding. So once students are decoding to connected text correctly and effectively, they are able then to generalize more closely. So it is really important to remember that so much work is involved in getting our students to that point of helping them feel confident with their learning to be able to actually let self-teaching sort of kick in, so to speak. But it is certainly something that explains the phenomenon that we have where students essentially learn more and figure out more than when we originally taught them. The last one is called set for variability. There's a little paper here that I did mention in the webinar number 1, but something worth looking at if you want to see just how important this theory is. Essentially, improved decoding abilities involves a certain level of flexibility in the potential pronunciations. This is certainly helpful when you're teaching those hard to read and spell words, or sometimes called irregular or sight words. These are words that break those sound letter patterns initially, and that we might need to help students to figure out the potential pronunciations of. Essentially, a word like bath, for example, as I used in the previous webinar, may be originally decoded as bath. Although that is an acceptable pronunciation in some parts of the world, the correct pronunciation does mean that A needs to make its third sound, which is the R sound. So students need some level of flexibility to try out different pronunciations, and that's exactly what set for variability means. Here's another one. So this looks like Ori to me, for example. It's got the O of jaw, for example, and then the and the E. But this is actually awry, which if we understand the morphology, we can pick apart. But being able to break this word up into a few different ways and trying different pronunciations is essentially what great readers eventually do, especially once that decoding is going really well. So set for variability is that third one. These are those 3 parts that come together. You can see that the learning here is actually quite, there's quite a lot involved, and there's all these little pieces that add up together into those bigger pieces over time, and that this is how we get students eventually to become competent readers, and with each sort of next milestone, getting closer to that sort of goal. So my launch here is essentially, how can we anticipate and counteract something that's a reality about learning, which is forgetting? And in the previous session, looking at cognitive load theory, we looked at forgetting as a really important part of that information processing model. So retrieval practice is one of the ways that we can anticipate and counteract the forgetting that does happen. Just a show of hands in the chat, or a little yes in the chat, for example, people that have heard of the forgetting curve before. This is essentially what we're looking at here, Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. Just to show, or I think we got the emojis and the reactions working last time. Thumbs up or a love heart or whatever other options you've got there if you have heard of this before. And if you haven't, I'm looking forward to explaining it to you. No takers yet on the emojis. All right, I'm going to assume, okay, some people, yes, thanks, Nicola. Some love hearts there. Oh, okay, yeah, now they're all coming in thick and fast. Okay, so if you haven't heard of this before, let me explain. So essentially in the 1800s, Ebbinghaus is a German psychologist. He decided to figure out how long he could remember strings of information. And essentially, there's a rapid decline upon first learning something to the point where a lot of it is forgotten, if not most of it is forgotten, after only a few days. You can see a rapid decline here too. This is 60%, but this curve keeps going and so forth down to 20% or 10% of first learning. And so essentially, if we never review the content that we're teaching our students, if we never get them to try and remember previous content, it's possible that they forget it completely, and that when they're asked to learn or use that information again, they have to learn it from scratch. Ideally, that doesn't happen because we don't want them to forget completely. We want to ensure that students do review or do some retrieval practice in order to allow them to remember as much as possible. So one of the ways to do that is by doing review or daily review, or what's sometimes called retrieval practice, which is getting students to try and remember what they've previously learned on an increasingly graduated sort of sequence. So for example, here you might have the next day you review it, then after 2 more days you review it again, and then after 4 more days you review it again. So you might think of this as daily, somewhat weekly, sort of the following week, for example, and maybe 2 weeks later, eventually, you might review it another time. Essentially, the rule of thumb of when to review something to get this forgetting curve to work is just before the students forget it to an impossible sort of amount. So here, I think it's really important to point out that each time that you review material, you'll notice this forgetting curve is lessening. So there's less that is forgotten over time, and this reflects a pattern of remembering and forgetting, which the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is famous for. So after each review, this curve lessens, and eventually, hopefully, we retain around 90 or 80% in our long-term memory. That's ideal. We can't remember everything, but we can try and remember as much as possible and get our students to forget as little as possible of that really important stuff. So retrieval practice is a really important paradigm here, if you like, a way of thinking about your work as a teacher. It's not just to teach, it's to facilitate remembering and to avoid complete forgetting. So retrieval practice is sometimes called, what's a nastier name, the testing effect, but it comes out of many bodies of research that shows that when students are asked to try and remember or to test themselves and test their memory, that it allows them to make stronger and more meaningful connections over time. And interestingly, active retrieving of almost forgotten information reinforces learning more than rereading or the teacher re-explaining. So although it might feel good when you're rereading notes in something that you've studied before and sort of like, oh yeah, I've heard this before, I recognize this, actually what makes you make more meaningful connections is actually being asked to retrieve it. So testing yourself to see if you remember it. And essentially, that is why retrieval practice or review, if you are teaching your students, is marked by not a lot of teacher instruction, but actually more facilitation or cueing for particular responses. So seeing if students can give the answer rather than what is more explicit direct teaching in the initial stages of learning, which is the teacher showing and modeling and then getting students to respond. When you're doing review or retrieval practice, you're getting students to do a lot of the heavy lifting because this is the kind of difficulty that they really need in order to ensure that they retrieve and retain all of that great information. Yeah, thank you. So that reinforcement does test their understanding and it makes those connections stronger. Thanks, Joanne. So when students are asked to retrieve, they actually make stronger, more long-lasting connections, and that there's less information that's forgotten over time. So one way to do retrieval practice, because this applies to any subject, we are going to focus in on reading and spelling because that's what we're here to talk about today. But retrieval practice applies to any subject that you're trying to learn. And you'll maybe remember for subjects or exams that you've done in the past where you have to really remember a lot of content, that instead of reading over your notes, a more useful practice is looking at flashcards and looking, one side is the prompt and the other side is the answer, and then alternating how you respond, whether you look at the answer and think of the prompt, or you have the prompt and think of the answer. And that process of flipping the card back and forth, trying to remember first and then checking, is really, really important. There's also some research to support, say, trying to remember something, covering up that thing and trying to recall it, and ideally with a space in between. So flashcards in that way, as well as a review session where you're getting students to practice that material, is actually really, really helpful and important for learning. But in previous times, has not necessarily featured a huge amount. Here are two resources that I really like on retrieval practice if you want to get your head around the whole concept and the reasoning behind it. As I'm sort of hinting at, this is not a phenomenon that is unique in many respects, but it isn't something that's very popular in a lot of schools as yet. Many schools are experimenting with the retrieval and daily review, and it might look differently across different subjects or across different parts of the curriculum and year levels. But the principles that apply are fairly similar, and there's much to be learnt from the successes that other schools and other programs have had in building this in. So most structured programs that have a strong set of resources for you to use will take advantage of this learning effect, which is retrieval practice, so that there's less forgetting happening, and so that there's more opportunities to form long-lasting memories and understandings. So one way to do that is what's called a daily review. And apologies, this hasn't come up quite correctly in the way that I want it to, with the material appearing one at a time. So here you are reading the whole thing all at once when I wasn't quite ready for that. And I'm just going to fix that now. There we go. So essentially, a daily review is a short, fast-paced warm-up to a lesson, and it's a chance for students to recall previously learned information. So like I said before, there's not a lot of teacher instruction. Instead, it's facilitation of recall, or facilitation of trying to remember. This could be quick, fast-paced, sort of short content, say mini whiteboards or choral responses, or it could also be some longer form sort of things like write this sentence or see what you remember about X, like a brain dump, so to speak. But it really just depends on the kind of knowledge that you're retrieving. For a reading and spelling session, it may well be choral responses make the most sense. Whereas, when you're getting students to spell things, you might get them to use mini whiteboards to spell words or to map words correctly. Ideally, it doesn't involve any new learning per se, because it's previously taught content. And ideally, you do this at a whole class level so that you get maximum benefit for all of your students and allow them to get the full range of access to that curriculum and those materials. You may need to do additional review, but that would be in addition and not instead of this daily review, which is for the whole class. So that's the crux of it. And someone's asking, is this session being recorded? Yes, it is, and it will be available on YouTube as per the other webinar sessions that we've run. Sorry, I tried trouble finding the word there that I was looking for. So daily review is a really powerful practice, and I want to show you an example of how this is built into the ELSA materials, just so you can see what I might be talking about here. So this is a typical lesson structure for teaching new phonemes and graphemes, and ELSA, like many phonics programs, have a really strong, predictable routine where new grapheme phoneme correspondences or codes are taught from across the day, from day 1 to day 4, following a simple and consistent structure. So basically it manages your cognitive load, so it's understandable what's happening from lesson to lesson, but also helps students to know what's expected of them and have that predictability. You'll notice that every lesson here starts with a review, and the review is previously learned content, including the sound letter patterns or GPCs, as well as hard to read and spell words and opportunities to read previously spelt and read words as well. And that's really important because it ensures that all of that great teaching and great learning that's been going on doesn't get forgotten. In fact, it's reinforced and caught up and practiced time in, time out. Something I said in the first webinar about this is when you're first going through content, you might feel, oh, I feel like one or two of my students didn't quite get that, or they might need a second exposure. This is where daily review and having this review structure at the start of your lessons does give you an extra opportunity to give them that second exposure. So many of my own prep students or kindergarten students, whatever you call it in your state or territory, many of my students actually needed that second exposure the next day or the next week. And that once they had seen it the second or the third time, because it was built into that daily sort of practice, they really did it then click for them. So daily review has that benefit when you're working with the whole class, is that you're helping students forget things that they've mastered, as well as helping some students get across the line towards mastery when they haven't quite made it for the first lesson. It's not really about just one lesson. It's about how all the lessons connect and combine over time and allow students to feel successful across many different parts. So let me just show you a little example of what these components look like. I'm going to show you this review section and how it does move into the other parts, and then we'll bring up the Oxford Digital sort of view if we want to see what it looks like in the materials. So the review usually begins with how quickly, and notice it's the emphasis on pace. Let's see how quickly we can say the sounds represented by the graphemes. And there are lots of beautiful little cards that go here that we're getting students used to. And as we've talked about, these mnemonics are really helpful initially, these graphic mnemonics, for how to help your students learn these particular things. So snake is swerve around the snake, for example. Octopus is around the octopus's head. And then C is curl around the camel's back. And these little grapheme sort of mnemonics are great for the visuals of how these letters work, but also help them to map onto the sounds that students are looking at. As we have talked about in previous sessions, ideally over time you fade out the mnemonics and fade out the reliance on pictures and prompts, and you just present over time, you just present the letter and see what they can make of that letter. Here's some other ones that are a little bit harder, but in these picture prompts, like as this is the far star, or what's this one here? Turn in the surf. So we've got some nice little mnemonics to remember these codes for. Essentially, over time, you want to fade out the reliance on the picture. So eventually it'll just be the letters and seeing if they can retrieve those. With a focus on retrieving it quickly, efficiently, and accurately. You can do most of this chorally, but what I really love to do when you're doing a quick daily review and going through some of these is that you actually call upon a few students to answer, one side of the room at a time or one group of the room at a time, so that over time they're able to do it. Eventually, if I can just get you to look at the video here, which is going to show something different to what I'm showing on the screen there. I might even be able to get this to just go black for a second. What's the quickest way to get that happening? Oh, here we go. Just go black for a second because I'm just showing you something on the video. So eventually you want them to show a sound letter pattern and to not have any other mnemonics, and to be able to just say oi if the sound is what they're doing. And ideally they look at something like this and they say j, and are able to retrieve that sound without having to worry or to use the mnemonic. So this is where over time you want to have those scaffolds such as the mnemonics or the visuals faded out and just have the letter to look at. So this would be sh, and you want everyone to accurately access. And this is for example. And the emphasis is on getting them through quickly so that eventually you can do your little warm-up. It only takes a minute and they're going through at a pace similar to this. So the kids are saying without your help necessarily. J, sh, oi. And the kids are then saying a, for example, and R, which is that R of star one that we looked at before. So this is a really fast-paced and sort of efficient part of your literacy block, but the beauty of it is that students are getting really familiar with the sound letter patterns so that they almost instantly pop into their heads when they're then reading lots of different words. We're still in this review phase of how the lessons might look, and no matter what your program, ideally this review has a range of different challenges. So sound letter patterns is one of them, But another one is reading hard to read and spell words. So these are regular words you want to giving them access to. So here we've got into, and we know it's hard to read or spell because this O is making an oo sound, which is more unusual. Here is go as well, and this is also the O is making an O sound, not the O sound that they might have learnt about. And here this annoying of, the F is making a V sound, just to be a little bit annoying. When students have that opportunity, not just to learn it once, but to keep coming back to it in this review, essentially it gives them more opportunities to get these right. And just in case you were wondering, hard to read and spell words or irregular words, you are going to sometimes use what's called a spelling voice in order to over-articulate, to be able to hear what it sounds like. So where possible, these ones are less sort of helpful to do that. I might look at if there's another option here. Those irregular words where you sounding them out using what's sometimes called a spelling voice can be quite helpful for students to be able to hear. I haven't got an example. My classic one in my head is like Wednesday, for example, or with people you might say people, for example. So basically giving them a way of pronouncing it that is closer to the spelling and that allows them to sort of map it together. So sometimes saying the letters that go with these can be really helpful with hard to read or spell words. So actually saying go is spelled G-O, go, G-O, and the same thing for of, O-F, of, O-F, and just basically because it is harder to sound out and that those letter names are quite helpful at this point. So that's a really, really important thing to review, not just the reading, but then notice there's spell these words as well. So in the front of class presentation in ELSA, you also have a moment where the words disappear and the teacher just has them to read. And this allows you to get students to try and spell these words as well, which is so, so important. So the next little opportunity to review, I think it's the second last thing, is we're going to sound talk some words. So essentially doing some phonemic awareness of sounding, blending them together and saying the word so that students can practice that skill. And this one, the words aren't visible. The teacher's able to see them when they click that little review button. So pretend you can't see these. I might zoom in just so you can't see them. Oh, how do I... There we go. So the students would see this and I would be able to see the words on the page. So do my robot arms in order to sound it out. So here's your next word, d, a, d. And then students would sound it out, d, a, d, and then blend it together with their blending hands, dad, and then smoosh it together, dad. And you know, this practice of hearing the sounds, blending it together is really a fantastic part of your daily review because it ensures that students are connecting and practicing not just that word once, but that word many, many, many times. The next word I've got for you is, and they get harder as they go, but in this list I've got job, then him, then let, then win, and these are all previously taught words, and basically organized for you so that students don't forget them, but making it easy for you to know which words to review on a lesson by lesson basis. Here's another one. I have to do the sounds in this word. So s, and then students do it as well. S, and then blend it together with their blending hands. Oh, so stretch it out. Mess, and then blend it together. Mess. And this really does help students to get that practice of that orthographic mapping because the phonemic awareness is the first part. And then putting it all together in words is the next part. So that same skill again, but now I've got letters to look at. We'd get them to combine the code knowledge of the first section with the cards, with the phonemic awareness of the second section that we've done with the sounds, and now we're bringing it all together. So sun, sun, and helping them to sound it out sound by sound and then blend. It's that same skill. Duck, duck, and rug, rug. And if you miss the first session, ideally you do keep your voice on for that. It's called continuous blending or continuous phonation to allow students to hear what the hidden words is underneath. Some words like the words with the stop at the front, like the d or the k, does make it difficult because your voice does turn off by nature of the sound, but trying wherever possible to keep the voice on, it could be fantastic. In terms of the next phase of the lesson, it moves to teach and then practice and apply. And these all sort of step out the lesson part by part. But you'll notice here another review at the end of the lesson. So in this case, this review is more like a check-in about all of the content that you've learned so far in the lesson, but also might just lead you in nicely to the review at the start of the next lesson. So at the end of lesson, after the teach and apply, there's a chance to say the sounds made by the graphemes and also read some extra words as well. And this kind of practice is really, really helpful to allow as many students as possible to get that practice. And also to know that you can comfortably say that students are less likely or not very likely to forget all that great learning and content. Because, as I'm trying to point out, teaching it once isn't necessarily a guarantee that they will have mastered it forever. Okay, so I've got some little key ideas to round out our discussion of retrieval practice, and then I'm interested to take any questions about review or about retrieval practice in general. Then we're going to go a little bit deeper and talk about spaced practice. So retrieval practice, some key ideas I have for you is that ideally you create really strong routines, but don't go through the motions. So that means ensuring that every lesson is really landing and ensuring that there's opportunities for students to really get the most out of the learning, and that you're not just sort of saying and repeating things for the sake of it. You're actually doing just enough sort of prompting or instruction in order for them to sort of drive the lesson. Especially for the retrieval or the review part of the lesson, ideally students are very much in control and they know the expectations, and they're not having to get a lot of extra support from you because they just know what to do so well. They're getting just practice, 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 and review, review, review. So if it's getting dry or if it's getting not quite working, you need to change up your responses, change up your pace, focus on making it lively and exciting, and also emphasizing those new parts. So if you've got new sounds that have been introduced and they just came in yesterday or the last week, show that excitement of the new things that students are learning, and ensure that they know what's expected of them. Cool. So, and just get my screens correct. Here we go. So, be purposeful with your questions. So, getting students on their toes, so to speak, ready to respond, but also set the pace. So, making sure that it is lively and ensuring that students do feel challenged and it's not sort of dry and sort of drawn out. Um, Something we have talked about in this series a few times is maximize the opportunities to respond. So a review is not a sit and sort of reflect opportunity. It's one where students can actively build the sounds, break them apart, retrieve the sounds from the cards, blend together lots of words, write lots of words, create sentences. All of this can be possible within the work that you're doing. Ideally, when you're noticing misconceptions, get right on it and create that corrective feedback. So if you do a choral response and everyone answers and you hear some off-target responses, make sure you reinforce and you say again what the right sound or the right word is, just so that you really nut out what that challenge was and fix the problem then and there. Ideally, using your data, I know there's really good built-in assessments to ELSA that you should be using to make good choices about whether to go back and reteach certain sections or certain lessons. But whichever program that you're using your observational as well as more formal data to ensure that you can put more into the daily review that might be needed. That can be a really, really helpful just a practice to have. So data should tell you, even if it's just observational data, should tell you what needs to be reviewed even more above and beyond what you might be doing. Some things to watch out for is like, what if students aren't familiar? What if they can't remember? Ask yourself this question: can you resolve it quickly? Can you just provide that instruction or that support then and there? Otherwise, if it's not easy to fix, try and make a note to come back to it. Say it's a difficult word that they're trying to read or spell, and it's not easy to explain. You might want to park it and come back to it in a catch up or a reteach lesson. Ideally, you don't fall into the trap of retrieval actually becoming a lesson in and of itself. It's meant to be the short component that warms up your lesson. Now, the review shouldn't be a replacement for that lesson. Ideally, if they're learning something new that they have or something that they've completely forgotten, you do it as a full lesson sequence. Okay. Are there any questions about review or retrieval practice at this juncture, just in case I can answer any queries at this point? It doesn't seem so. Thank you for taking that moment just to pause and to potentially reflect. I'm now going to launch into what's called spaced practice, and this relates beautifully to retrieval because spacing and interleaving is one of the ways that we can engineer opportunities for students to start to forget, but not forget completely, because forgetting is a process that we can't avoid and that we want to take advantage of as well. So let's look at spaced practice. Or this should say practice rather than practiced. So let me just fix that for you, because why not just fix it on the fly if you can. It's only a few extra letters. There we go, fixed it. So essentially, there is a difference between cramming, which is sometimes called massed practice, and spaced practice. And I have to thank my colleague, David Morkunis, who created this diagram a few years ago, and I still use it because it's so helpful and visualizes it beautifully. So the end goal, let's say it's fluent reading and spelling, for example, might be what you're aiming for. If you put all of your practice into an intensive session, the equivalent of cramming the night before, it's going to result in less less beneficial long-term retention, less sort of successful for performance than if you take that same amount of time and space it out over many days and potentially weeks. So the reason that space practice is really effective is because it allows our brains to start to forget what we have learnt and then build stronger and more meaningful connections by trying to remember what we've learned. If the brain thinks that it's worth keeping because we keep reviewing it or keep retrieving it and looking at it over a period of time, then it's less likely to delete those memory cookies, so to speak. And as a result, be something that students hold on to for the long term rather than the short term. So I think we may have all crammed or studied intensively the night before an exam sometimes. And essentially, this is one of the, necessary things when you're running out of time. But in an ideal world, you would actually space your learning out very, very sequentially and systematically so that you can give your brain a chance to process that information, start to forget it, but then remember it just in time. And this is a great practice to do in the way that you sequence your curriculum in any subject. And we'll look at some examples of how that is structured today as well. So the other difference that I want to compare to, so that was just going back, that was massed versus spaced practice. So being able to see the difference there between cramming and spacing learning over time. The other difference I want to share with you is the difference between blocked practice, where one skill or one grapheme or one group of letters is practiced intensively, a little bit like, and I hope I don't make any too many assumptions here, a little bit like sort of learning a group of spelling words and looking at them for a whole week. But never probably looking at them again, or at least not until the next year, and then looking at a new set the following week and a new set the following week after that. That idea of blocked practice is nowhere near effective as the opposite, which is interleaved practice. So this is where words are practiced and are taken in and out of the review or the practice schedule so that students have more opportunities to go back and forth between different kinds of patterns, different kinds of words. So ideally, you wouldn't have a whole week just dedicated to one spelling pattern and then have a whole week dedicated to another spelling pattern without an opportunity to try back and forth like I've done here. So interleaved practice is where you go back and forth between similar or related content or sometimes distinct content to allow your students to get the difference between them. Classic example would be the difference between spelling the AI, which I've got here somewhere, and the AY. So here's the AI, like in the middle of the word, and the AI is somewhere else in this pile, which I can't necessarily find. But the AY is at the end of the word. Ideally, you wouldn't practice that. So it's the AI all week of one sort of focus, or 6 sessions in a row just on one of those, and then the following week 6 sessions on the other. Actually, you'd want to be an opportunity where after they've got some currency with that sort of pattern, AY versus AI separately, that you then bring them together and sort of go back and forth between previously learnt content so that you allow them to master when to use AI versus when to use AY. If you don't realize or don't know, AI is the middle of the word, AY is usually the end of the word or end of the syllable. And it's just a really useful one for students to get their head around. Same thing for OI and OY, if you didn't realize that as well. So interleaved practice in some ways also builds in the sense of spacing, because session by session or day by day, you're giving students a range of different things to practice, and not just the same set of things to practice in one week intensively and then never touching it again. Actually going back and forth between topics purposefully for that reason. So spacing and interleaving can be seen in a lot of synthetic phonics programs, and I want to show you how that sort of looks in the scope of ELSA, for example. So this is an overview of Foundation, Phase 2, Phase 3, and Phase 3 to 4, just to show you an example. And what you've got here is some different content introduced in week 1. So SATP, INMG, and MD, sorry, GOK, and CK. And then CK, E, U, and R, with some extra hard to read and spell words introduced as well. You can see in this list down the bottom. What you see here in week 5 is that we introduce a little bit more, so a double S, for example, but essentially do mainly review in this week. So not only in the lesson structure is there review in each lesson. So let's say it's week 2, we're actually reviewing content from here. Week 3, we're reviewing content from here and here. And week 4, we're probably touching on a bit from one of these weeks on in a graduated process. But there's also a chance to pause new content and to bring all of that complexity together to allow for spacing and interleaving and consolidation. So having opportunities for review weeks or consolidation weeks in your sequences are really important. And if you are using ELSA, that's why it's been designed in that way, because it allows your students to consolidate, it allows you to check and assess where they're up to, and also to allow for that benefit of that you're not just drilling something for that 1 week and hoping that it all sticks. You're actually going back and forth between areas and eventually mixing them all up. So getting students to spell not just one set of words, but many sets of words from many different weeks, because that's the true test that they've mastered, is that they can spell any of those words, no matter if it's been the focus or not. Because if we're really honest with ourselves, when we teach spelling intensively like this and focusing on one set of words for a week, it may well be that the parents have actually crammed with their children the night before on the Thursday night to ensure that they've learnt those words for the next day. And as we know, cramming doesn't lead to long-term retention, and neither does this massed, or so this blocked practice where it's only learning one thing and then moving on to a next set. So ideally, you mix things up a little bit in this way, and that's why ELSA has that structure. Here's another example from Phase 4 and Phase 5 of the Foundation sequence. Essentially, you can see here we've got different consonant structures coming in, which, if you didn't realize, actually build upon all the previous knowledge that is there, where individual CVC words are introduced. So all of these CVC words are built upon these grapheme phoneme correspondences, with the first digraphs and vowel digraphs introduced in week 9 and week 10 of this phase. Actually, after that, then we have another review week, as well as some more long vowels, and then another assessment and review week, and then a review week here as well. So it brings you sort of to the end of term 2, depending on where you are in the sequence. But then building upon all that knowledge again, so continuing to use that knowledge but in a different way, we then introduce more tricky consonant types. And I've skipped ahead a few weeks here, but just to show you what it looks like, is that we build upon all of that previous knowledge. We have a suffix, and we have actually 3 suffixes that are introduced. So the ed, t, and d sort of pronunciations of the past tense. But then we're also bringing in different syllable structures and mastering how those work. And of course, still pausing every few weeks to have an opportunity to consolidate and to connect previous learning over time. And this, although it seems like, there seems like there's a lot of assessment and review weeks, there's a lot of pauses. These pauses allow you to go faster in the long term because you have less forgetting happening, less students losing the traction and losing that connection over time. Here's an example from year 1, where in Phase 5, we've got some revising happening from previous years, and revising this and connecting it with more difficult to spell words, so coming at it a second time. But we've also got some review for year 1 up to week 4, and then up to sort of week 5, reviewing those previous weeks from yeah, about a month or more than 5 weeks ago, for example. And this is by design so that students don't lose traction and are able to connect with all these different ideas. In terms of a big overview, if we zoom out again, essentially you can see what the focus is, and essentially how often new content is introduced. It's relatively rapid because there is lots of things that are achieved by the end of foundation. All of these things achieved, but they're phased in. They're phased in over time, which is really powerful as a learning sort of practice. And because of all the review, you can build upon those strong foundations and move forward. Another place you can see this is in the year 2 part of the sequence, where there is a really big focus on consolidating the knowledge and consolidating these new graphemes that haven't been introduced before, but then adding in different spelling patterns. And as you can see here, there's not as many review weeks featured in this little diagram, but essentially review would be in every single lesson. So students can continue their learning as they consolidate things with that retrieval practice on a lesson by lesson basis. So I'm hoping that gives you a little introduction to those 3 big ideas. They were retrieval practice, interleaved practice, and spaced practice. I don't want to just take it as a given though, because here's my little CFU question. I've got 3 scenarios for you, and I want you to match it into the chat of which ones match each of these, A, B, or C. So number 1, is it A, B, or C? Is studying a topic in regular intervals provides greater retention than, say, cramming. I wonder which one that is. Is it retrieval, interleaving, or spaced practice? Studying a variety of topics or variations in short bursts is more effective than studying only one topic at once. So I wonder which one that would be. And the last one, bringing topics or skills back after a period of time makes memories more durable and flexible. So if you can respond in the chat with what you think that might be, you can go 1 and then the letter, 2, then the letter, and then 3, then the letter, if it makes sense. Haven't got any takers yet. People are getting their chat sorted. If you press enter once you're confident, don't worry if you get the answer wrong. That's how I can explain things better. That's always a good thing when teachers uncover misconceptions, as we know, is that they can address them. Okay, and hopefully you've had time to answer. So I will just have a little glance. Okay, yeah, most people have put something in there, and some people are still thinking. Thank you very much. All right, let me just show you, reveal the answers for you. Here we go. Fancy animation coming. Ooh. So it should be, here we go. It should be 1C, 2B, and 3A. And I'm seeing some of those answers. I'm liking what I'm seeing. So great. So 3 interconnected but very powerful teaching practices. Thank you very much for doing that little exercise, because it helps us understand how it all fits together. So that's spacing, retrieval practice, and interleaving. And hopefully you've seen in an example program like ELSA how that might look, and I guess why it's been structured in that way, in case you were wondering. It is more review and it's more spacing and more interleaving than we're probably used to, given that these practices are not necessarily hugely common practice depending on the programs or the approaches that people have used in the past. This is powerful teaching, the strategy or the topic that I introduced before. This other one, if you're in for an interesting read, How We Learn, is also a really great book that introduces a lot of these principles, and it's just really great because it summarizes the cognitive science of effective learning processes, and how the brain is a pretty incredible thing, how it makes meaning and learns things over time. And the subtitle here is Why Brains Learn Better Than Any Machine for Now, hopefully for as long as possible. So, my little reminder before we finish up is linking this back to the idea of explicit teaching and what it involves. Explicit teaching is not is sort of a very static or directive, very agnostic sort of thing. It's something that is completely dependent on and the responses from students, and it should be an interactive, structured, and high student participation approach. So ideally, you're activating students' prior knowledge all the time, you're stating clear learning objectives, and also connecting to that prior knowledge and doing that daily review. You're providing explicit explanations of that new content in manageable chunks and using structures like the I do, we do, and you do, or the different phases of the lesson, like the lesson structure we've looked at today, as well as doing frequent checks for understanding to inform that responsive teaching. There's many different opportunities to respond because explicit teaching is active. And essentially, if you're finding the lessons aren't quite landing or if the students aren't quite active enough, you want to engineer opportunities for students to do this. Sometimes it's called engagement norms, sometimes opportunities to respond. Essentially, you're getting students to do different things in order to make it work. So it should be active. It should be connected to. And then this is a great point that Matt's just made, sort of going back to here, the different parts of the forgetting curve. Matt's asking the question if it is related, not exactly the theme of today, but links with desirable difficulties. So desirable difficulties is basically a way of talking about some of these powerful learning practices, and it's from a theorist or two theorists called Bjork and Bjork, a sort of colleagues with the same last name, and they basically said that there's some learning strategies that are a little bit annoying for learners. That's a bit harder. It's actually easier to reread your notes or to cram the night before, and it's easier to get someone to re-explain it to you. But the difficulty of retrieving information, of spacing learning over time, and of interleaving, so going back and forth between topics, can be really, really helpful to allow students to get deeper and more meaningful memories, but also closer understandings. So Matt's question relates to desirable difficulties as well as the idea of contextual interference. So this is where they might have trouble applying some of their reading and spelling. I'm just using a reading and spelling example when they're in the context of writing or reading rich literature. So this kind of contextual interference can be really helpful and is a desirable difficulty to allow for that eventual mastery of the content. We don't want them to be just great at reading and spelling during the reading and spelling session. We want them to use those skills in meaningful reading and writing opportunities. So eventually, applying these same practices when you're creating a shared text together or getting students to craft their own texts when they're writing, as well as picking apart and trying to figure out what the authors are doing in authentic text as well as decodable text, can be really, really powerful. So then I've got another question from Joanne. Would you encourage to incorporate mixed group abilities into explicit teaching strategies? So I'll go back to this sort of opportunities to respond. It is definitely possible to teach in a really effective way with mixed ability groups. So, the whole class or most of the class teaching, mainly so that your tier 1 instruction is for everybody, and that small group instruction may well follow this, especially as ELSA talks about ensuring students keep up instead of catch up. So giving them additional interventions or additional small group supports to enable them to stay on track and ensure that they don't fall behind. But essentially, the first port of call is explicit and responsive teaching with that whole group to begin with. When you've got students that are really high flyers and that are really doing amazing things already, just always have up your sleeve the opportunity to challenge them with bonus words, bonus tasks, and maybe putting that word into a sentence, while others might be diligently writing that response one letter at a time. Now we're getting close to wrapping up, so I just want to hit home with some big messages and link back to some of the content from previous webinars in the fashion of retrieval practice and sort of spacing and connecting learning over time. Essentially, why would you do retrieval and spaced practice? It's because it takes advantage of the natural process of learning, forgetting, and remembering. So thinking back to this diagram that we looked at last time, essentially learning is always a process of finding information from the environment that we want to pay attention to, trying to pull it into our working memory. But when students are first doing this for the first time, they may be overwhelmed by the whole task, say reading a whole sentence or reading a whole story. They try and hold in their working memory, but then they can't. It's sort of too much. So our job as teachers is to come along and to provide some instruction that allows them to pick out the bits that are important. So here's the codes, or here's the strategy that I want you to use. Let's see if you can hold that into your working memory and then get it into your long-term memory for later use. Then this is the cool part. Once it's in long-term memory, it's not there forever. What enables it to be used again and again and again to keep solving problems is essentially the idea that we can get students to retrieve and recall previously learned information, currently in long-term memory, so that they can apply it to novel situations. So here's a similar learning task as before. If we get them to retrieve and try and remember, this is more effective for them to try and solve the problem using recorded information than say if we just told them the answer again. Telling them the answer again makes it feel like they're successful because then they can then do the task. But ideally, we've told them the answer, they've practiced it, they've put it into long-term memory, they've slept on it, maybe for one night, maybe for a few nights. Then we've given them a chance to apply that learning again. And when we ask them to retrieve, that's exactly what they're doing. They're pulling stuff from long-term memory, they're then applying it and hopefully getting the answer right, and therefore getting closer and closer to mastery of that content in meaningful circumstances. My last little point is just to revise and to talk about what kinds of things would you review. We looked at how ELSA talks about these different aspects and how they structure them in the lessons, but these big picture ideas of where they fit in is the key aspects, coming back to the start of the webinar, to encourage students to orthographically map words, to help them kick into that statistical sort of learning, that ability to self-teach new patterns because they get so good at reading and spelling, and also giving them an opportunity to flex, so that's set for variability. So the things that you're going to be reviewing are phonemic awareness. And ideally, students are sounding out words, they're blending, they're segmenting, given that they're the most important skills for reading and spelling. They're also nearly always practicing this skill with letters, although sometimes they're doing it verbally, but nearly always with letters. And that this practice should be daily. And then based on how students are going with that review and that practice, they might get additional support or intervention. With the grapheme cards, we're giving them that initial visual mnemonic, and verbal mnemonic potentially as well, which are really lovely, but also phasing out the visual and verbal mnemonics over time, so that eventually they can just remember the word. Remember the grapheme or what sound it makes, because that's what then leads to their ability to read and spell. And then in terms of blending and segmenting, it's a reciprocal process. So spelling lots of words gets better at reading, although reading lots of words doesn't always improve spelling. It does go back and forth. When in doubt, just read and spell lots more words with your students. If you've got more time, chuck in a few bonus words. I wonder if you can help me spell this word, or let's read this word together. I'll just put it up on the board. So more and more and more is always better. This is my little reminder, is that reading only gives you reading, but spelling gives you reading for free. So when we get students to spell more words and get that spelling happening, you get decoding happening without adding any extra time, whereas reading typically only improves reading. We have a little bit of time, a few minutes for some questions. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you've started to see the benefits and the importance of spaced and retrieval practice. And I'm really excited to hear, I guess, what you do next and any questions that you might have. So on the lookout for any questions. 3 minutes to go. I'm hoping that this has been helpful for your understanding of how programs like ELSA, but any learning that you're doing, can improve your students' retention and ability to master the content that you're teaching, especially in that phonics and early reading sort of realm. Just on the lookout, Bryn, for any responses. Here's one from Michelle.
That's one. Yep.
So Michelle's asking about numeracy. That's outside the scope of this particular series. I know that Oxford does have a maths program. I'm not sure if it says it's all completely available or it's the same in different jurisdictions, but it's not one that I'm familiar with, because my focus with Oxford is on literacy. But this kind of learning about spaced practice and retrieval practice definitely applies to mathematics as well. So all the things I've said about the importance of spacing, of retrieving, of interleaving is definitely applicable. And if your current way of teaching maths doesn't include that, I think it's a really important addition. Fiona's saying thanks. Janelle's got a question. At my school, it's expected the daily review is done using slides, and teachers are finding it's very time consuming. Do you have any thoughts? So going back to that point that I had, is that you need to make sure that as you're doing your daily review, that you don't let it turn into a mini lesson. So this is my little rules of thumb that I had up from before. Ideally, if the students aren't familiar with the content, decide whether it can be resolved quickly and you give them the quick answer. Otherwise, make a note to it and come back to it as a proper lesson, and don't fall into the retrieval practice becoming a lesson in itself, because that's not the purpose of the review. It should be short and sharp and relates back to what you've been learning previously. So there's something to be aware of. Ideally, it's not too time consuming, and if there is difficulty with that, it's sort of a question of pacing, but also of not wanting to get trapped into a mini lesson rather than the retrieval practice. Trisha's got a question about changing this for upper primary. With upper primary, you wouldn't necessarily be reviewing the phonics in the same way that we've talked about today, but you would be reviewing things like reading, spelling words that you've been working on, morphology that you might be teaching, sentence patterns, and any other sort of discrete skills that you've been working on. And to answer Justine's questions, thick and fast, the questions are coming now, Bryn. Where does morphology fall in? As you would have seen in that little segment of the year 2 sequence, there's quite a bit of morphology that comes in the year 2 part of the sequence, particularly around there's some rules here around adding in suffixes, but then there's a suffix y, there's also the suffix est, there's also the suffix able. So these common suffixes, as well as his meant and full. So there's quite a lot of prefixes and suffixes in there. Where morphology probably takes over in a program or a curriculum that goes further than 2 is that in year 3 and 4, for example, you might introduce base words, and allowing students to learn lots of different roots and bases. So hopefully that helps and sort of lays the foundations, and knowing that there is more to do after F2, but our focus has been firmly on this. I'll let Bryn explain this last little slide.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Yep, as everyone is probably aware, I know a lot of people have registered for the whole series in each 4. We've had 3 webinars so far, including today. All those recordings are available on our website or on our YouTube channel. If you haven't registered already for our 4th one, implementing impactful paired reading sessions in your classroom, please do. I can send around the link to everyone in the follow-up email after the session, August 27th at 6 p.m. Yeah, I think it'll be a really interesting session, as all of these have been. They're so incredible to listen to. Thank you, Nathaniel. Just to follow up on a few questions in the chat, everyone will get a recording of the session as well as the slides, and a PD certificate if that's something you're after as well. I will follow up in the next couple of days with all of that information. Yeah, that's probably all there is to say there. Lots of thank yous in the chat for Nathaniel, and I want to say that again myself. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And everyone who joins after a long work day, I know it can be a lot, but yeah, really appreciate everyone joining. It's been, awesome. We'll just go through the chat again. I'd like to register. Yeah, I'll send you the link in a follow-up email, and we'll get that for you. Thanks.
And thank you for having me, Bryn and the team. It's been a pleasure, as per the other sessions, and I can't wait for the webinar 4 on the 27th.
It's going to be great. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.